Imagine traveling the open road, seeing things that few from your hometown have seen or will ever see, bearing witness to wonders and marvels, hearing from locals and experts about how things got to be the way they are, and hearing other stories about even more distant lands and the fabulous phenomena that lay there. Long before Lonely Planet, Jack Kerouac, or lame travel blogs, Herodotus, father of history, had them beat by thousands of years in about 1,062 units of coolness.
This is the showing forth of the inquiry of Herodotus of Halicarnassus, to the end that neither the deeds of men may be forgotten by a lapse of time, nor the works great and marvelous which have been produced by some Hellenes and some by barbarians may lose their renown, and especially that the causes may be remembered for which these waged war with one another. So begins the first book of the Histories of Herodotus, written in the 5th century BC. As it tells us, he sought to preserve the great human achievements of his age and his world for future generations, so that their brilliance would not fade away the way the paint does on a statue. He is acutely aware of his own place in time and how it changes all things. In his own words, "I shall go forward further with the story, giving an account of the cities of men, small as well as great. For those which in old times were great have for the most part become small, while those that were in my own time great used in former time to be small. So then, since I know that human prosperity never continues steadfast, I shall make mention of both indifferently."
To do this, he traveled thousands of miles, covering almost the entire known world of his day, and interviewed countless informants. He recorded stories both fantastical and factual, and in so doing, created the first work of what we now consider to be history. Without him, we also wouldn't have as much information as we do about the Greco-Persian wars of the 6th and 5th century BC, and we certainly wouldn't have such movies as 300 and its sequel, Rise of an Empire, due out next year. Herodotus is humanity at its best. He serves as a paragon for our indelible intellectual curiosity and insatiable thirst for knowledge. He was also one hell of a traveler and storyteller. Today on Totally Awesome History, Herodotus, historian of wonder.
Before Herodotus, anything resembling history arose out of a need to preserve memories of the deeds of kings, royalty, and gods. The Hebrews had their Torah, the Egyptians had their royal histories, and the Indians had their holy books. But this was the first time that anyone systematically carried out research into the past for its own sake. While it's true that the logographers of ancient Greece preceded and were relatively contemporary with Herodotus, they usually only wrote down stories and accounts of individual places. Herodotus was the first to look at the big picture, of a sweeping history of man as he knew it.
He's also different from Homer and the other authors of more legendary and mythological material that we have, in that he gives us human causes for circumstances and events rather than just divine ones. Where he does give us a divine cause, he also gives us a thoroughly human one. And in this respect, he was nothing short of a game changer.
Born sometime between 490 and 480 BC in the Greek colony of Halicarnassus, Herodotus came from a well-to-do family and was well educated, especially in Homer. Eventually, he was exiled by the tyrant Labyrinth and took up residence on the beautiful island of Samos. Not long after, he returned to Halicarnassus and participated in a successful coup against Labyrinth, but left again because for some reason he was unpopular with the citizenry.
And you can just imagine some Halicarnassians saying, "Oh look, there goes Herodotus again, gallivanting and travelling all over the place. Oh no! Why don't you just find the missus, settle down, watch the telly, there's plenty on these days." Good thing you didn't listen.
But he did travel. After leaving Halicarnassus, Herodotus traveled over nearly the entire length and breadth of the known world, usually by foot, gathering the information that we find in his writing. He traveled to Egypt, Libya, the Black Sea, Scythia, Macedonia, Thrace, Delphi, Babylon, and many other places in the Greek and barbarian world. As he did, he watched and listened, taking in all he could. He was a man fascinated by life in the world, the causes of things, both hidden and human, and he worked to inspire others to that same end. While he does discuss politics and war in his histories, we can see that he was even more interested in the world at large. Geography, natural history, anthropology, technology, commerce, architecture, religion, and the strange and sensational things of the world populate the bulk of his work.
To give an idea of some of the unbelievably cool stuff he witnessed and tells us about, we need look no further than the greatest of the ancient wonders of the world itself. And you've probably never even heard of it until now. Even greater than the pyramids at Giza or anything else in the world at the time was the great Egyptian labyrinth at Hawara.
Already over 1,300 years old by the time Herodotus visited it, he tells us that this labyrinth was enormous. It had 2 stories, each with 1,500 rooms each, a dozen indoor gardens, white marble columns, walls covered in paintings and hieroglyphs, the equal of which he'd never seen. At the corner of the labyrinth lay a pyramid with the relief of large animal figures.
Even more fascinating, he tells us, was the man-made lake called Lake Moeris. Surrounded by desert, it was fed via canals from the Nile. Its perimeter was 666 kilometers long, the entire length of the Egyptian coastline. And in the middle of it, 2 pyramids rose out of the surface 90 meters high. What's super fantastically outrageously cool for us today is that in 1888, an English archaeologist named Flinders Petrie found a massive stone plateau which he thought was the foundation of the once great labyrinth. He believed the labyrinth itself had unfortunately been used as a quarry for hundreds of years and there was nothing left of it. Then, in 2008, a team of international researchers conducted a geophysical survey of the site, called the Mataha Expedition, and found that the plateau Petrie found wasn't the foundation of the labyrinth, but the ceiling. It's been there all this time, buried under the sand. And as for the layout in relation to the pyramid, it matches Herodotus' description exactly.
Herodotus also had a profound respect for the cultures and practices he encountered on his journeys. The word cosmopolitan doesn't even begin to do him justice. He never says the Greek way is better, and in fact, he frequently praises other cultures for their ingenuity.
One of the few exceptions that he makes, a practice which he calls shameful, is actually a case of sacred prostitution in Babylon. Basically, every woman who reaches maturity has to present herself to the temple of Ishtar, the Babylonian equivalent of Aphrodite. And she's not allowed to leave until a stranger has chosen her to have sex with. Now, needless to say, as Herodotus points out, the pretty ones get to go quite quickly, but the ones with more personality have to stick around a bit longer.
He also comes to the conclusion that even though all cultures are equal, a man generally favors his own when given the choice. While traveling, he spoke to locals, priests, and anyone who could provide him with reliable information about the past. He also inquired about the customs of the peoples, lands, animals, and wonders that he encountered at the time, as well as those that lay beyond the horizon. Although, admittedly, not everything he heard was true.
For example, he tells us about stories that he's heard of wild men and women who lived to the east of Libya, with dogs' heads and faces in their chests. And he talks about things like the phoenix and winged snakes that come out of Arabia. But whenever he does talk about fantastical creatures, he always reminds us that these are only stories that he's heard. Whenever possible, he encourages us to use our own critical faculties in ascertaining the truth behind them.
Herodotus must have been a fine speaker, one of those people you could listen to for hours. His work would have originally been read aloud in parts to a live audience, and he would have had to have been good at this if he stood any chance at winning them over. In Herodotus' day, reading and writing were not solitary or reflective pursuits, the way we think of them. Rather, in the majority of cases, reading and writing were really preparations for an oral performance. Born in the time he was, Herodotus would have had one foot in the older oral storytelling tradition and the other in the newer literary one. One scholar has even suggested that books back then were used in the same way that music scores are today. In any event, he was a superb storyteller. So much so that between 450 and 444 BC, the city of Athens awarded him a hefty sum of money to write and present the results of his research to its interested citizens. And when the hustle and bustle of Athenian life got too much for him, he retired to the colony of Thurii in Italy to complete his work.
Regrettably, even since antiquity, Herodotus has been the butt of criticism from historians and members of nearly every other academic discipline in the humanities and social sciences.
Some even go so far as to call him not the father of history, but the father of lies.
But the vast majority of these criticisms have been undeserved. Too often he's been judged by the standards of a later time and within the context of more modern methodologies and approaches to knowledge. Historians have criticized his history, biologists his biology, anthropologists his anthropology. Unfortunately, a lot of the criticisms have simply come in the form of, well, he's just too darn interesting. How could he possibly be telling the truth? Yeah.
But the truth is that such notions would have been foreign to Herodotus. When he uses the word historia, he means an inquiry or an investigation. So even though we call his work the Histories, a better title might be the Inquiries. And let's not forget what he says over and over again. He only intended to report what he had seen and been told by his sources. That's it. But this doesn't mean he didn't apply scholarly rigor to get at what he believed to be the truth. An example of this is when he questions the account in the Iliad of Paris and Helen fleeing together to Troy.
He prefers to believe an account told to him by the Egyptian priests. It says that after they fled Greece, Paris and Helen went to Egypt, where they were detained along with Menelaus' treasure by the Egyptian king Proteus. Meanwhile in Troy, the Greeks were demanding that King Priam of Troy hand over Helen and the treasure. But they weren't there, and Priam told them as much. If they had been there, surely Priam would have given the Greeks what they wanted. As Herodotus points out, why would he risk war over the antics of his wayward and immature son? Unfortunately, the Greeks didn't believe him, and the Trojan War happened.
In another case, Herodotus proved too skeptical and disbelieved stories that the Phoenicians had sailed around Africa, when they actually had. With the development of anthropology and archaeology, Herodotus has been vindicated over and over again. Mummification, the existence of Amazons, cultural practices of the Scythians, gold-digging ants or marmots, the list goes on. One great example of how scholars who previously scoffed at Herodotus were humbled is the case of the lost army of the paranoid Persian emperor Cambyses.
You see, around about 525 BC, mad old Cambyses sent an army of 50,000 strong out into the desert to the oasis at Siwa. He wanted to bring an attitude adjustment to the priests of the Oracle of Amun there because they refused to acknowledge his rule over Egypt. Trouble is, the army never made it. No one really knew what happened to it. Herodotus eventually found out what happened by asking the priests of Amun themselves.
They had got to a point about midway between them and the oasis. While they were taking their morning meal, a violent south wind blew upon them, and bearing with it heaps of the desert sand, it buried them under it, and so they disappeared and were seen no more. Thus the Ammonians say that it came to pass with regard to this army. For a long time, scholars dismissed this as another case of a fanciful story told by Herodotus. But in 2009, two Italian archaeologists found what many believed to be Cambyses' missing army.
Because of this, we can see that he was a pioneer. He took the closest thing to a scientific approach at the time and presented his findings to the world.
Given more time, who knows how much more archaeologists will discover that proves Herodotus correct? If his work can be said to be any indication of his personality, then while he lived, Herodotus was one interesting guy. He writes with such intimacy and charm that it feels like we are looking at his world with the same wide eyes and open-mouthed wonder that he must have possessed. It's why he's still one of the most widely read and readable of all ancient historians.
Herodotus sought to preserve the memory of all the great deeds and achievements of the world he lived in. Thereby, he unknowingly made his own work one of those achievements. In the same way, his life can serve as an inspiration to all the curious wanderers of today. Exile, traveler, researcher, storyteller, no one title seems to fit him entirely. But one thing is for sure, not only was Herodotus the father of history, he was the father of totally awesome history.